She dialed 911 because, according to her, my lawn seemed too confident. Not joking, she stormed up like she had a warrant in hand, flashing a red notice as if it were a badge, and yelled, "This whole cabin is a visual violation." And honestly, I wish that was the strangest thing she said. Somewhere between accusing my trees of tanking neighborhood property values and claiming I was emotionally trespassing, I realized I needed to start filming. What followed became the kind of spectacle nobody in the neighborhood could have predicted. Feel free to comment where you're watching from and if you've ever crossed paths with your own clipboard-wielding dictator. I'd love to hear the wildest thing they've said. The autumn sunlight spilled across the wooden floorboards of my grandfather's old cabana, the very ones he used to scrub down every Saturday before settling on the porch to watch the lake. I inherited this place back in 1988, and every creak of the wood carried the memory of childhood fishing trips, family barbecues, and calm evenings spent watching the sunset over Clearwater Lake. As I worked that morning, I kept picturing Grandpa in his favorite rocking chair, coffee in hand, watching the world go by. I doubt he ever imagined someone with a superiority complex would one day try to evict his spirit from the porch. The peacefulness shattered when a thunderous knock rattled the front door, loud enough to make you think a SWAT team had arrived. I had just wrapped up my usual morning sweep when it started. I opened the door to see a sharply dressed woman in her late 30s. Wrapped in a navy blazer like it was battle armor, gripping a clipboard like royalty would a scepter. In her hand, a blazing red sheet of paper screamed with warnings and threats. "I'm Valerie Greaves, president of the Clearwater Pines Homeowners Association," she said with the kind of tone that implied she ruled her own private kingdom. "I need you to sign this document acknowledging your numerous violations of community standards." Her voice dripped with authority, and the way she clutched that clipboard made it clear she was used to people giving in without question, like trained animals responding to a whistle. I glanced at the paper, which read like a laundry list of exaggerated complaints. "My cabin," she claimed, "threatened the community's aesthetic. My truck was apparently dragging down property values. My landscaping, a menace to neighborhood harmony." The language was thick with legal jargon, clearly crafted to intimidate. When I looked back up, she was holding out a pen, clearly expecting me to roll over and sign away my rights without question. "Would you mind showing me the official documentation proving the HOA has authority over this specific property?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible. Her confident smile faltered just slightly. Instead of presenting any actual evidence, she responded with a smooth deflection. "That's not something you need to worry about," she said, her tone sharpening. "What matters is complying with the same standards the rest of the community manages just fine." The emphasis she put on the rest of the community made it clear she saw me as some sort of rebellious anomaly disrupting her perfect little kingdom. I folded the notice with care and handed it back, unsigned. Her expression shifted through confusion, shock, and then the dawning horror that her clipboard might not be the wand of absolute power she thought it was. "This is my family's home. It's been ours since 1988, I said quietly, "and I won't be signing anything today." Her transformation was immediate. Her cheeks went red, her jaw clenched, and she gripped the clipboard so tightly I thought she might try to swat me with it. "You have 48 hours to bring this property into full compliance," she snapped, her voice like ice. "Otherwise, you'll face serious legal consequences." She spun on her heel and stormed back to her spotless white SUV. But not before pointing one last time in what I suppose she thought was a threatening gesture. As she drove off, she took a slow lap around the neighborhood, likely logging every little detail she could use in future crusades. I stood on the porch for a long while after she left, thinking about how Grandpa would have handled these, likely with the quiet confidence of a man who understood the value of calm persistence and solid documentation. He believed in being prepared, never making empty threats, and always having the paperwork to back you up. Lessons I realized were about to come in very handy. I stepped back inside, poured myself coffee in the same chipped mug he used for decades, and sat at his old kitchen table, the one where he had handled life's challenges, large and small. Holding that mug grounded me, reminded me of his steady wisdom when the world tried to rattle your nerves. "Don't fight loud, fight smart," he used to say. Looking through the windows he installed himself, I realized that defending this property wasn't just about a legal argument. It was about honoring him. About standing for something real. Something told me I'd need every ounce of that quiet strength. I pulled out my phone and opened the county land records site. This was only the beginning of what was sure to be a very enlightening week. Grandpa always told me, the best victories are the ones won before the fight begins. And I had a feeling Valerie was about to find that out the hard way. The next morning dawned cool and clear, perfect weather for learning a few lessons. I was on the porch with my first cup of coffee when a black SUV rolled into my driveway like it owned the place. Two men in khaki uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand, badges on display, walking up to my door with the air of people told this was a routine stop. "We're here on behalf of the HOA to perform a tree and vegetation inspection," the taller of the two men said as he checked his clipboard with the precision of someone used to routine procedures. I calmly set my coffee aside and put on my most agreeable smile. "Of course, come on in," I said, opening the door wide and gesturing inside with exaggerated warmth. "Can I get you gentlemen some coffee while you go about your work?" What they didn't realize was that I had already started recording. My phone, discreetly placed on the kitchen table, was capturing every word of the visit. The inspectors moved briskly through the house and yard, snapping photos, jotting down notes, and chatting freely with each other, apparently assuming I was just another docile homeowner who saw things their way. "This entire zone is under HOA jurisdiction," the shorter man told his colleague, pointing toward the backyard. "Everything from the main road to the lakefront was brought under association control in 2010. I kept up my helpful host act, asking seemingly innocent questions while keeping their conversation going. "How long has the home managed this area again?" I asked with wide-eyed interest. They were more than happy to walk me through the supposed time linear, completely unaware that every detail was being documented for future use in a very different kind of setting. Once they wrapped up their inspection and drove off, likely patting themselves on the back for how smoothly it went, I grabbed my keys and headed straight to the county land records office. The clerk there was courteous and knowledgeable, explaining that property boundary surveys were common requests, often tied to home improvement or utility work. "I need a fresh survey done for a waterline maintenance project," I told her, carefully filling out the required paperwork. She stamped the form and confirmed a certified surveyor could be dispatched within 2 business days. I paid the fee and left the office with a sense of progress, like a chess player who had just moved a strategic piece into play. As I made my way back to the truck, I passed a hallway display of old land plats and maps from the 1960s showing Clearwater as little more than scattered parcels by the lake. One of the earliest belonged to my grandfather, his name faintly visible in faded ink. I paused there, imagining how he might have reacted to today's HOA nonsense. He probably would have shaken his head, maybe even laughed, knowing full well that the land would speak louder than any hollow threats. The brilliance of my plan was that it was entirely above board. I really did want to confirm my property boundaries. That it could also reveal the limits of the HOA's authority, well, that was just a bonus. On the drive home, I found myself grinning. The recording I had from the inspection included multiple bold claims about HOA control, claims that were about to go head-to-head with official county records. I had a strong suspicion they wouldn't match up quite how Valerie had hoped. Pulling into my driveway, I immediately noticed her pristine white SUV parked across the street, engine idling. Valerie herself was behind the wheel, watching my house like she was on surveillance duty. She had clearly seen the inspectors leave and was now likely imagining what kind of compliance strategy I was cooking up, oblivious to the fact that my plan revolved around actual property law, not her inventive interpretation of it. I gave her a bright, friendly wave, which seemed to irritate her enough to make her speed off, tires squealing like it was a movie getaway. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cold beer and replayed the recording on my phone with the satisfaction of someone unwrapping an early holiday gift. The audio was crisp and clear, capturing not just their confident claims about HOA control, but also a quiet background conversation I hadn't noticed earlier. Near the end of the file, I picked up a faint voice, and undeniably Valerie's speaking on the phone. "Just make sure you tell him it's whole land," she said. The recording cut out right after, but those words were enough to make me sit up straighter. It seemed the HOA president herself wasn't as sure of her footing as she let on, and suddenly, those old stories Grandpa used to tell me about land disputes in the 90s were sounding a lot more relevant. A few days later, I was in the workshop organizing tools when I heard vehicles pull into the driveway. Peering through the window, I saw a full professional surveying team unloading gear that looked like it belonged on a NASA mission: tripods, electronic scanners, and computers that probably cost more than my entire truck. I stepped outside to greet them with the casual demeanor of a homeowner overseeing routine work. The lead surveyor was all business, explaining they'd need several hours to complete a detailed boundary assessment. "Take your time and do what you need," I said. "I'll be around if anything comes up." What I didn't mention was that I fully intended to keep a close eye on the process, especially if any nosy neighbors decided to intervene. I had just started pretending to work in the garden when I spotted Valerie's SUV speeding down the street. She came barreling down the street like she was responding to some kind of emergency. Her SUV screeched to a lopsided halt, and she stormed toward the survey crew, clipboard in hand like it was a badge of authority. "What exactly is going on here?" she snapped, voice sharp and demanding, as if expecting the crew to drop everything and offer immediate answers. The lead surveyor looked up from his equipment with the calm demeanor of someone who had dealt with many a self-appointed authority figure. "We're conducting a standard boundary survey at the request of the property owner, for maintenance planning," he said smoothly. Valerie's face tightened, clearly unhappy with the answer. "And what kind of maintenance requires a full boundary survey?" she asked, edging closer to their equipment like she was about to declare it contraband. "This land is under HOA oversight, and any significant changes need board approval before they begin." The crew chief referred to his paperwork, then met her gaze with firm politeness. "Ma'am, property boundary verification is the legal responsibility of the landowner, and HOA doesn't have any say in determining where private property starts or ends." One of the surveyors suddenly turned toward me, looking puzzled. "Sir, could you come here for a moment? We're noticing some inconsistencies between the physical markers and the official county records." I walked over, feigning mild confusion. Valerie, of course, followed right behind me, clearly unwilling to miss a moment. The crew chief laid out a detailed site map on the hood of his truck, pointing to various color-coded boundary lines. "According to the official county plats, your cabin and the surrounding land fall entirely outside the Clearwater Pines HOA boundaries," he explained. "The HOA's jurisdiction ends roughly 50 feet before your property begins. Legally, they have no authority over this land whatsoever." The silence that followed was complete, so much so I could hear the hum of traffic from the main road in the distance. Valerie stared at the map like it had been written in code. "That can't be right," she said eventually, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "We've been managing this land for years." The surveyor offered a neutral shrug. "Management doesn't alter legal boundaries, ma'am. These lines were set by the original land grant and have been on record with the county since the 1960s. I folded the official report carefully and slipped it into my shirt pocket, keeping my expression pleasantly surprised. "Well, that's certainly enlightening," I said, as if this wasn't exactly what I'd hoped for. "If it's grandfathered in, then it still falls under our authority, doesn't it?" Valerie asked, desperately trying to grasp at anything that would restore her power. The surveyor looked at her with a kind of patient weariness. "A grandfather clause exempts a property from new rules. It doesn't hand control over to an organization that never had it in the first place." Valerie went silent for a moment, clearly rethinking everything she thought she knew. "That's not what I meant," she said finally, though the words rang hollow. The surveyor didn't bother responding. He just turned back to his equipment, signaling the conversation was over. Predictably, Valerie wasn't finished. "This is a mistake, and I will prove it," she snapped, pointing a shaky finger at me. "I'm calling my lawyer, and when this is over, you will comply with our community standards, or face the consequences." She spun around, fumbling with her phone as she stomped back to her SUV and sped off, no doubt headed somewhere she could fire off her legal threats in comfort. I thanked the survey crew as they packed up, feeling very much like a chess player who had just realized his opponent had brought checkers to the match. That night, I sat on the porch with the survey report spread out in front of me, finally understanding why Grandpa had always been so sure of himself when it came to this property. It wasn't arrogance, it was preparation. He knew the power of paperwork that actually meant something, and he never let bureaucracy shake him. 3 days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a notice for an emergency community meeting to discuss recent violations set for that evening at the community center. It was dressed up in official whole letterhead, signed by Valerie in her role as president, though notably, it wasn't addressed to me by name. It was sent to all Clearwater Pines residents. It didn't take much to read between the lines. This meeting was clearly about me, but I wasn't exactly invited. I spent the afternoon weighing my options and ultimately decided that sometimes, the best move is to show up precisely where you're not expected, especially when you're armed with information no one else knows you have. I put on my sharpest outfit and got ready to pay them a visit. I threw on something presentably business casual with a hint of I don't belong to a MOBA, grabbed a small notebook, and made sure my phone was fully charged. I had a feeling this was going to be an enlightening evening. When I arrived at the community center, the place was already buzzing. It was clear Valerie had spared no effort. A projector was set up, chairs aligned in orderly rows facing a makeshift stage, and neat stacks of printed handouts waited on a table, no doubt outlining why my humble cabin was apparently a menace to civilized life. About 15 residents were scattered throughout the room, most looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I slipped into a seat in the back row, silent and unnoticed, notebook open, ready to jot down every detail. A few people noticed me and whispered among themselves. Valerie, however, was too caught up in her orchestrated drama to realize the target of her entire meeting had just walked in. "Thank you all for being here on such short notice," she began, her tone heavy with a sense of false urgency, as though she were addressing a national emergency. "We're here to discuss a serious threat to the value and harmony of our community." She flipped through slides that featured photos of my cabin, dramatically describing it as a visual blight and asking the group to consider a vote for removal, conveniently skipping over whether the HOA had any actual authority over the property in question. "This homeowner has repeatedly ignored violation notices, refused to sign compliance agreements, and shows no interest in adhering to the standards we all follow," she said, pointing to a deliberately unflattering picture of my cabin that somehow made it look like a haunted shack. A few neighbors squirmed in their chairs, clearly uncomfortable. I saw a few glances tossed my way, some curious, some sympathetic. "This property is absolutely within the boundaries of the HOA," Valerie said firmly, "and we have full legal authority to enforce compliance by any means necessary." That's when I began to notice the shift. Someone whispered to their spouse, "Didn't he live there before the HOA even existed?" Another murmured, "Did she even confirm the boundary before launching all this?" I stayed quiet, watching the subtle ripple of uncertainty start to spread across the room like a coffee stain on white carpet. When she opened the floor for questions, one brave woman raised her hand and asked, "Have you actually confirmed that the HOA has jurisdiction over that property?" Valerie's answer was a masterclass in evasion. She danced around the question with a bunch of official-sounding jargon that amounted to, "Just trust me." That's when I discreetly hit record on my phone again, leaving it running on the seat next to me. "Based on the issues we've reviewed tonight," she said, trying to regain control, "I am calling for an official vote demanding compliance or removal of the non-compliant structure." She phrased it so broadly and patriotically, you'd think we were voting on world peace. One by one, hands went up, many from people who clearly didn't understand the full context. The final count was 12 in favor, 3 opposed, and a few who abstained, likely wishing they just stayed home and watched TV. "The motion passes," Valerie said with theatrical pride. "This community has spoken. The property owner now has 48 hours to begin compliance or face legal action." As the meeting wound down and people began filing out with that strange mix of confusion and guilt, I stood up and made my way toward the door. Valerie spotted me for the first time and froze. She looked like someone who had just seen the ghost of the person they were gossiping about. "You weren't invited to this meeting," she said, her voice lacking its usual steel. I smiled calmly. "Public meeting, public building. I came to listen." She stared as I walked out, clearly unsure if I was considering or planning something much bigger. "The truth?" I was planning something. And thanks to her overly dramatic slideshow and a very public vote, I had everything I needed to move forward. Friday morning arrived crisp and clear, my favorite kind of weather, and I felt especially cheerful. I'd spent the night crafting a perfectly worded email to the county code enforcement office, complete with audio recordings from the meeting. I had spent the previous evening crafting an email that was equal parts precise, professional, and quietly devastating. It included the official survey report, along with audio clips from the home meeting where Valerie had overstepped her bounds. The subject line was simple and direct: false claims of property authority, evidence attached. Every word had been chosen with care to ensure the tone remained calm and factual, and no need for drama when the facts were this powerful. I hit send at exactly 9 a.m., then took my coffee and newspaper out to the porch, ready to wait. I didn't expect Valerie to take the news quietly. I didn't have to wait long. Around 10:30 a.m., Valerie's white SUV came flying down the road like she was being pursued by a SWAT team. She braked hard in front of my cabin, tires squealing, then leapt out of the vehicle, phone in hand, and immediately began pacing the sidewalk, gesturing wildly and talking in an agitated voice that echoed across the quiet lake. From my spot on the porch, I could catch bits of her conversation. Other neighbors had come outside to watch the commotion. Several were already filming, phones discreetly angled to capture every second of the unfolding spectacle. This was Valerie's moment, in her dramatic display of HOA dominance, complete with the high-stakes flair of calling in law enforcement to handle the unruly homeowner who dared to challenge her throne. 911 emergency services, she said into her phone, intentionally loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. I need to report illegal occupation and trespassing, she announced, as though she were describing a hostage situation. There's a man refusing to vacate land that's under HOA control, she added, pointing in my direction for emphasis. He's ignored violation notices and refuses to comply with community standards or recognize our authority. I stayed put, sipping my coffee and occasionally waving at neighbors who were now openly recording. I wondered whether Valerie realized how deep she'd just buried herself. Within 15 minutes, a sheriff's patrol car pulled up. Out stepped Officer Jack Reynolds, a man in his early 50s who moved with the calm precision of someone who had seen his fair share of property disputes and knew most of them were more about pride than crime. Valerie made a beeline for him, clipboard at the ready, fully expecting him to slap on some handcuffs and drag me off the porch. "Thank you for coming so quickly, officer," she began, still riding the adrenaline wave from her dramatic call. "This man is trespassing on HOA property. He's been warned, and we've even held a vote to have him removed." Reynolds listened politely, jotting notes in his pad, but his face stayed neutral, betraying none of the urgency Valerie expected. "Ma'am," he said finally, "before we go any further, I need to see documentation showing your organization's legal authority over this specific property. Committee votes and HOA notices don't establish jurisdiction. That requires actual land ownership documents." Valerie's face faltered, her confidence wobbled as she realized her clipboard might not be the weapon she thought it was. "Of course we have authority," she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "We've managed this area for years. Everyone knows this land is within HOA boundaries." Officer Reynolds remained polite, but firm. "Property law doesn't operate on what everyone knows. I'll need to see legally filed documents that prove your association's right to manage or enforce regulations on this parcel." At that point, I stood up, survey in hand, and walked down from the porch with the calm of someone who had just watched their opponent walk into checkmate. "Officer Reynolds," I said, extending a hand, "I think I can help clarify things." I handed him the certified county survey and pulled out my phone. "Here's yesterday's boundary report showing that my land lies fully outside the HOA's jurisdiction." And these I tapped the screen is audio from a recent community meeting where the HOA president stated, in no uncertain terms, that my cabin does not fall under HOA control. Valerie's expression went through several transformations in rapid succession: disbelief, panic, realization. She looked like someone discovering mid-sentence that the microphone was still on. Reynolds reviewed the documents carefully. Then, I played the clip where Valerie's voice could be heard declaring the cabin outside HOA line as of just 2 days ago. A heavy silence followed. The only sound was the soft clatter of Valerie's phone hitting the pavement, slipping from her suddenly limp hands. Reynolds closed his notebook and turned toward her with the kind of expression a teacher gives when catching a student cheating and trying to decide whether to call the principal or the parents. "Ma'am," he began, "you are going to need to explain. Why did you tell 911 you had authority over land that, according to your own statements, isn't even under your jurisdiction?" Officer Reynolds asked, his voice tight with restrained irritation, of the kind that only comes from dealing with nonsense on a day when he'd rather be somewhere else. Valerie tried to recover, though it was like watching someone trying to patch a leaking dam with duct tape. Her voice was rushed, frazzled. "That recording is completely out of context," she said. "And even if there were some boundary confusion, we've been managing that property for years based on community consensus and historical precedent." The officer didn't flinch. His response was immediate and razor-sharp, slicing through her excuse like a seasoned fact-checker. "Ma'am," he said, "property law isn't based on consensus or tradition, it's based on legal ownership and properly recorded boundaries. And everything I've seen so far contradicts your claim." That felt like the right moment to step in with another carefully selected piece of ammunition. I pulled a folder from my pocket, as something I'd assembled days earlier in preparation for a moment exactly like this. "Because, apparently, I'm the type of person who brings receipts to a clipboard fight." "Officer," I said, offering him the folder, "I also have emails exchanged between the HOA and the county obtained through a public records request that clarify the HOA's lack of authority over my property." I handed him the printed emails, which revealed something Valerie clearly hadn't expected to resurface. County officials had notified her 2 years ago that my land was not under HOA control and that any enforcement attempts would be, in their words, improper and potentially unlawful. The moment she recognized the emails, Valerie's composure cracked like glass under pressure. Her face flushed crimson, her hands trembled, and her words came out in erratic bursts, like a malfunctioning speaker. "Those emails were just preliminary communications," she stammered. "Things have changed since then. Besides, he's still violating standards that affect everyone's home values." Not exactly a compelling legal defense. "The situation hasn't changed," Reynolds replied, his voice now edged with finality. "Property lines are legal facts and not negotiable preferences. What has changed is that you've now made a false police report, knowingly claiming authority you were previously told you do not have." That last statement landed like a punch. Valerie took a visible step backward, stunned by the implication. Her attempt to weaponize law enforcement had just detonated in her own hands. By now, several neighbors had drifted closer, drawn in by the growing sense that something significant was happening. You could feel the air had shifted. This was no longer about one cabin. It was about trust, power, and all the invisible strings Valerie had been pulling behind the scenes. And those strings were snapping. I glanced around and noticed how many people were giving her looks ranging from embarrassment to disbelief, like they had just realized they'd bought front-row tickets to a show they didn't want to be part of. One neighbor, a woman in her 50s who had been one of the few to vote against Valerie's proposal, spoke up. "Are you saying we were misled about what the HOA actually controls?" she asked the officer. "If that's true," she added, "we deserve to know what else was decided based on incorrect information." That single question opened the floodgates. Suddenly, voices rose from every corner. People began expressing doubts about the HOA's voting processes, the legitimacy of their rules, and even the use of their dues. The room wasn't angry yet, but it was skeptical, and skepticism spreads faster than outrage when trust is broken. Valerie looked around in growing panic, scanning for allies, but all she saw were averted eyes and tightly folded arms, and neighbors quietly reconsidering every dollar, every vote, every demand they'd previously accepted without question. "All our actions have been in good faith to protect property values," she said softly, but the words rang empty even to her. They sounded less like leadership and more like the closing line of a bad defense. Like claiming you broke into someone's house just to make sure it was secure. Claiming you robbed a bank to protect the economy doesn't make it legal, Officer Reynolds said dryly, flipping through his notes one last time before issuing what amounted to a final verdict on Valerie's brief and now collapsing reign as neighborhood overlord. "Sir," he said, turning to me with a tone of calm assurance, You are the legal property owner and fully within your rights to use your land as permitted by county regulations." Then he turned to Valerie, and his expression shifted and no longer neutral, but firm, like a teacher about to hand back a failed exam. "Ma'am," he said, "you've made false statements to emergency services, claimed legal authority you do not possess, and possibly crossed the line into harassment by repeatedly trying to assert control over land that is not under your jurisdiction." The blood drained from Valerie's face like someone had pulled the plug on her confidence. It was probably the fastest she'd ever learned anything in her life. "I should also inform you," Reynolds continued, "that filing a false police report is a criminal offense. If this behavior continues, you could face legal consequences including harassment and possibly fraud." He snapped his notebook shut with finality and headed back toward his patrol car, leaving Valerie standing alone in the middle of the street, surrounded by neighbors whose expressions had shifted from deference to something much colder: betrayal, disappointment, and anger. The kind of anger that festers not just from what was done, but from the realization that it was done under the pretense of helping you. As Officer Reynolds drove away, the gathering crowd began to break up, but not before a few neighbors came over to offer quiet apologies and gestures of goodwill. "I'm so sorry for all this," one older gentleman said, shaking his head in visible disgust. "If we'd known she was feeding us misinformation, none of us would have backed her actions." I accepted their apologies with grace, letting them know I understood they had been misled, but inwardly, I was thinking of my grandfather, how he would have chuckled at the way the truth finally caught up to a paper tyrant, just as he'd always said it would. Valerie lingered in front of my cabin for several more awkward minutes, still seemingly in shock, as if trying to mentally rewind the last 24 hours and find the point where she could have taken a different turn. Eventually, she walked slowly back to her SUV, not making eye contact with anyone, and drove off without the usual bravado. It was, frankly, the smartest decision she'd made all week. The following morning arrived wrapped in silence, the kind that only follows a storm. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the first calm sunrise I'd seen in weeks. It was peaceful, satisfying, the kind of morning that made inheriting the cabin feel not just like a blessing, but of vindication. Around 9 a.m., I heard cautious footsteps scrunching over my gravel driveway. I looked up to see Valerie approaching slowly, her posture deflated and her expression drained of the authority she once wielded like a weapon. In her hand was a single piece of paper. Gone was the confident march, the clipped tone, the air of superiority. She moved like a student headed to the principal's office, nervous, resigned, and utterly humbled. "I need to post this apology letter," she said quietly, almost whispering. The lake breeze carried her voice away faster than she could speak it. She reached my front steps and, with trembling hands, taped the letter to my cabin door. There was no flair, no speech, just the mechanical motions of someone fulfilling a requirement they never expected to face. It was, she admitted, part of the settlement agreement to avoid criminal charges for filing a false report. I waited until she stepped back before reading it. To her credit, or, more likely, her attorney said it was a thorough and unequivocal admission of fault. I, Valerie Greaves, exceeded my authority as HOA president and misrepresented jurisdiction over private property. The cabin in question has never fallen under HOA governance. All violation notices and enforcement attempts were unauthorized and should be disregarded. The letter closed with a formal apology addressed to me by name and an announcement of her immediate resignation as HOA president. Honestly, it might have been the most responsible decision she'd made during her entire term. As she finished her task, she turned to me, her voice faltering but sincere. "I want you to know I really believed I was protecting the community," she said. And for the first time, she didn't sound like someone clinging to control. She sounded like someone who finally realized what it cost her to pretend she had it. It was probably the first honest thing Valerie had said to me throughout the entire ordeal, though, admittedly, a bit late for sincerity. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I realize now I was just trying to control something I had no right to." It was a remarkable admission from someone who had, not long ago, treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered she had tried to have me arrested for living on my own land. After she left, I walked to my workshop, grabbed a hammer and a screwdriver, and made my way to the front edge of my property. There, mounted on two sturdy posts, stood the Clearwater Pines HOA monument to overreaching fabricated authority. Several neighbors gathered quietly as I methodically removed the sign, unscrewing each bolt and setting the hardware aside in case someone wanted to repurpose it, though, based on the crowd's mood, it was more likely they'd want to forget it ever existed. The sign was heavy, awkward to carry, but the weight didn't matter. The satisfaction of removing it made the labor feel light, like toppling a statue that never deserved to stand. In its place, I installed something new, a simple wooden plaque I had crafted the night before, with the same care and precision my grandfather brought to everything he built. Private property, a original owner since 1988. Smaller, humble, honest, a quiet tribute to truth in a neighborhood that had lately seen too little of it. By late afternoon, word had spread about Valerie's resignation and the truth behind the property boundaries. What followed was an impromptu gathering on my front lawn, and neighbors dropping by to apologize, to vent, and to start the healing process. We had no idea we were paying for services we never actually received. One couple admitted, they had only lived here 2 years and were clearly wondering what else their real estate agent had left out. If the HOA never had real authority, another neighbor asked, then what were we paying all that money for? It was a fair question. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that many residents had been writing checks for a system that had no legal standing, essentially paying for fiction. I recommended they contact the county for guidance on recouping those payments and establishing legitimate services if they still wanted them, though I advised skipping the part where they put someone in charge just because they owned a clipboard and a loud voice. As the sun dipped low over Clearwater Lake, casting a soft amber glow across the water, I found myself back on my porch, fresh coffee in hand. Peace, finally, in the air. Across the street, I could see movement through Valerie's windows, packing boxes. Word was she was moving out of state, hoping to start over somewhere new, where no one remembered her clipboard crusade or her creative approach to authority. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood had begun organizing a loose volunteer committee to handle basic upkeep. No titles, no bureaucracy, no threats of fines for untrimmed hedges, just neighbors looking after each other. Funny how well people can get along when nobody's trying to play dictator. The biggest lesson: real community doesn't require enforcement, it requires respect, and nobody needs rules for that. The final scene of this entire saga couldn't have been scripted better. Me, sitting on the porch of my grandfather's cabin, watching the lake shimmer in the gold of sunset, the modest wooden sign standing out front, the neighborhood quiet and calm behind me, finally free from manufactured conflict and petty power plays. I raised my mug in a small, silent toast to my grandfather, to patience, to preparedness, and to the truth, because sometimes, all you need to win is to let facts do their quiet work, because the best way to deal with people who confuse power with wisdom, let them speak long enough to expose themselves, then step back and let the truth finish the job. The lake was still, the air was clean, and for the first time in weeks, all I could hear was birdsong, leaves rustling, and neighbors rediscovering what it meant to just live in peace, which, all things considered, might be the most beautiful sound in the world.